Hello everyone. Welcome to a video series on the Crystal Tarot. The aim for this series is to document some of the process through which I'm going to be building my relationship with this deck. In some ways, therefore, it will bear a certain amount of similarity to the series I did on the pagan otherworlds, which is still ongoing. Link in the description and all that. The main difference here is that I won't obviously have an opportunity to interview the creator of the deck as I did with the Pagan Otherworlds Tarot. But what I'm hoping to do here is build a relationship with the deck, document some of that process, and kind of show what that looks like in sort of installments. Show the organic process of it, shall we say. This is my copy of the Crystal Tarot. It is trimmed, it is edged, sort of an old gold / red gold kind of thing going on here. I made a bag for it that in general matches the color scheme of the deck. So this is the bag, little button on the inside, yellow lining. That is often how I approach making bags, is finding a way to relate it color scheme wise to the deck in question. As you will have seen in my last video, a little glimpse in my last video, I did a magical working with this deck, which was intended to emphasize the elemental symbolism in this deck, but also, so on a conceptual level, but also give me a very distinctly physical connection to this deck. The original impetus for that idea, the original idea behind that was not mine. I saw something somewhere on Patreon, in a particular place on Patreon, that was basically purposefully relating the elements to a tarot deck with the aim of connecting with it as an object and getting it kind of messed up and dirty. So very, very briefly, I will not go into the details of the magical working because it's very personal, but very briefly, I basically subjected this deck to different experiences of the elements. So this deck has been placed in a flame, in fire. This deck has been, it's gotten wet on purpose. This deck has, like, I've done a whole bunch of things to this deck with the elemental sort of symbols and ways of thinking in mind. Very specifically to reinforce a connection between me, my physical self, and this deck, the physical object, also to be less precious about it. So I've been taking this everywhere with me in my bag and so on and so forth. In terms of my personal exploration with this deck, put it aside for a moment. I got myself a copy of the Synthetic and Practical Manual of the Tarot by, I think, Eudes Picard, I think is how you say that name. The original book was published in 1909 in Spanish. This is a translation. Unfortunately, I did get it from Amazon. I wasn't able to figure out how to get it in Ireland in physical format without using Amazon, so I'm a little disappointed in myself for that, to be honest. I do believe there are parts of this book available online, either in PDF format or in blog format. So I will do my best to find some of those and link them in the description, because I probably should have gone with that, in fairness. But so the deck basically is using the pip system as outlined by Eudes Picard in his 1909 book. I have whole thoughts about this system and this approach that I will likely address in a separate installment in this series, because I want to make sure I'm getting like my thoughts kind of succinct and sort of more clear and consistent before I really cover what I think about the book. But loosely, just very, very briefly, the majors in the Picard system are the Marseille majors, and then the pips are his own interpretation, largely along elemental and numerological lines with aspects of astrology and sort of his own understanding of certain types of symbols and symbolism included. I will say one interesting thing about this book, about his approach, is, let's see if I can find a page where this is made very clear. So I don't know if you can see, but for example, for the majors, you will get in a section called commentary, little citations at the end of these sort of bullet points, which are actually him referring to historical works on the tarot. I think there's a section at the back. Is it at the back or at the beginning? There's a section where some of the initials that he uses for these citation sections is like a recommended reading section, so that some in I think it's mostly for the majors, he kind of says, here's my interpretation, but also like these are the historical tarot works that I'm functioning out of, these, you know, famous historical esotericists, etc., etc., etc. So it's an interesting process thus far, but I'll reserve most of my assessment of this book for another installment in this video. So basically what I'm going to do now is show you some footage that I've collected over the last week or so, couple weeks I think, of just some of the early thoughts I'm having about, like, as I go through this deck. What I'm doing currently, you'll see that this is sort of in order. This is the 4 of Pentacles, so here's the 3, here's the 2. I'm going through suit by suit. So the wands, I think, are at the back of this sort of set of the, like the sort of front section here. Yeah. So I've already done the wands, and the footage I'm about to show you will be some responses I was having as I worked my way through the wands system. And with the aim, very specifically, of developing a personal relationship with this deck, and my own set of associations. So once again, this is not prescriptive. It's certainly not teaching material. It's me kind of starting out by saying, hey, this deck makes me think of this. Here's this idea. Here's this emotional response I'm having, literally card by card, and saying about like where and when that comes from, say, a specific tradition or reminds me of something, but that's not the same thing effectively as saying that the deck itself is intended to be like that. So for example, just before I switch over to that footage, you know, I personally think this deck lends itself really, really well to a very sort of medieval Irish literature informed perspective. I see certain stories from Irish myth in these cards myself. And I think that the color scheme feels very medieval illuminated manuscript to me. I don't think it's a huge imaginative leap to kind of visually associate those things just mentally and in terms of personal gnosis, as it were. I think, as with the Pagan Otherworlds Tarot, actually, as well, there is a very sort of, again, mystical, elemental, otherworldly, like this literally reminds me of, what's the name of it? I'm going to forget the name in Old Irish. But it's a particular story about, what is it called? My goodness. Is it the House of the Two Vessels? Anyway, I'll put the name on the screen, but basically there are certain stories that the ways in which these cards show themselves make me think of like specific things. Like I could do all sorts of things in my head with this, with like the Psalm of Amargan, or there's a particular essay that I'm reading right now exploring incantations in medieval magic and medieval Irish tales. That literally has this whole echoing segment from first Acallam na Seanórach and then into the sort of framing device with St. Patrick and Acallam na Seanórach. So like there's a whole thing about like this group of 3 red-colored with red hounds kind of invaders who then get banished through shows you how dignified myth is, the fart of a magical hound off to sea to then hit each other over their heads with swords and things like that. Like there's just interesting plot elements that I see in this deck. I see like the Salmon of Knowledge kind of things in this deck. So the point is that I'm going to be approaching this with like some of my own favored stories, favored traditions, and that, and so on and so forth, and personal experience, and talking through that. So before I ramble on too much more, I will switch to other footage in which I am rambling through my experience of this deck. So stay tuned if you are interested in that. And yeah, I'll see you on the other side.
So I don't have much battery. I'm gonna try to sort of record what I'm thinking about at the moment. Anyway, it's early morning. I've been up since 5:30. It's currently 6:44, so it's actually not that early. Like, there's humans awake outside, so it's officially like daytime in my head. It's only early when I have enough time of no other humans, or almost no other humans. Anyway, so that's the reason for the croaky voice and the puffy face and all that kind of thing. So I'm going through taking notes on the pip cards from the Crystal Tarot. And as I'm doing that, listening quietly to some old-timey trad music from the US. Been trying lately to get a little bit back into like refreshing some of the sort of more Appalachian stuff that I would have played many years ago. But I'm finding it really tricky and really difficult. And interestingly, like going through these cards kind of confronts me with why, or at least part of why. Because one of the things I'm interested in maybe trying to do with these cards, very similar to some of the things I've discussed with the Pagan Otherworlds Tarot, is relate them on a ecological and animistic and setting-based level. So in some ways, you know, the embodiment of worldview level with Irish myth and the Irish mythological tradition, because I think that the color scheme, the jewel tones, the geometric patterns, and some of the visual themes in the deck lend themselves to that. It's a very, to my perception, it's a very medieval looking deck. Some of that's because there's literal knights and kings and things in it, but also, and queens, and so on. But it's also because it really does look rather illuminated to me in terms of stylistic choices, and some of the geometric patterns also, to me, bear a lot of resemblance to some of the current animation styles in, for example, movies like The Secret of Brennan and The Secret of Kells, and my personal favorite thus far, oh my god, I can't think of the name all of a sudden because it's morning. Song of the Sea, obviously. Of course it's called Song of the Sea. Jesus Christ. Anyway, I have yet to see Wolfwalkers, by the way. I'm working up to it. I'm working on it. I'm a little like, Anyway, so I'm having this interesting response, though, because I think maybe also inspired by the fact that I have been trying to amalgamate this sort of like really, really severed feeling. I feel very truncated. And I've often asked myself why that is. And some of that is family-based traumatic experiences and so on and so forth. I don't want to overuse the word trauma, by the way. So I'm also not going to be explaining what I'm talking about here. Anyway, so there's various reasons I feel very truncated about past experiences, past settings, where I'm from, and all that kind of thing. And wishing to amalgamate those things in some way, find a way to reintegrate those things in this kind of alchemical crucible or cauldron that is me and my brain and my, you know, sources of inspiration and the things I care about. So as I'm going through these cards, for example, I'm looking at the Two of Wands in this deck, and comparing the actual book as translated into English, but the actual book by Eudes Picard from 1909, and then writing down some notes about what I see in the Crystal Tarot, because the Crystal Tarot does not actually perfectly fit with his delineations for the cards. Sometimes it does and sometimes it doesn't. So I have here, you know, at the Two of Scepters, it talks about a fire burning at the base of the card. It talks about the union of two forces in this nourishing environment. Two forces associated for a productive end, collaboration, alliance, high moral objectives, and so on. And it emphasizes that we have at the base fire, which in this deck seems to be represented in a highly geometric manner, and as well as ears of corn, which it later says are wheat. So I see in this card mostly wheat stalks. You can see behind the wands, I hope. There. And then at the top, there are grapevines. So I see a very agricultural world as represented in this card. I don't know if animist is quite the right word, but you could very easily look at this and make mythological, like medieval mythological associations with the idea of goddess. If we take the name Macha to imply or mean a demarcation of territory, especially as related to horses in her case. But if there's this notion, like for example, the story of Macha being carved with her brooch pin and so on, a demarcation of territory for the purpose of things like animal husbandry, potentially also cultivation. If we think about fire festivals and their agriculturally seasonal nature, and so on and so forth. I think there's a lot that can be done with this card. But I think there's also something to be said for the amalgamation of two things within the self. And as I was working on this card, thinking about Irish mythological tradition and literature, looking at this book, and then also thinking about this notion of... So what I was saying is that, looking at this card and thinking about things like medieval Irish symbolism, maybe certain specific stories, the tradition, that all of that kind of loose coagulation of remaining literate sources kind of creates what we know about that, what we don't know about that, that kind of thing, exploring that world, relating that visually to the card, then reading the book, seeing where the book differs, where the book gives me certain ideas and so on. And then also thinking about that notion of relating, I suppose in an animist sense. I hope the word animist is kind of what I actually mean. But relating the sort of more animist understandings of things like environment, ecological surroundings, and so on. Amalgamating that with my personal experience, if we're talking about, again, collaboration, alliance, associating two things, bringing them together into a kind of personal alchemical whole. Again, maybe that's a very sort of temperance card, like, union of opposites, or maybe the lovers, the alchemical component of that and the transformational potential of that. Again, we're at the sort of early part of the suit, so this is the 2, right? It's almost like this is part of how we kind of hone our idea, in this case of self. I, again, was listening to trad music kind of also while doing this, which is an interesting choice. And I was reminded of a recent emotional experience I had that was really unexpected. And in some ways it was in response to something positive, but it was something having to do with sensory stimuli and setting and what role that does or doesn't play in my own personal past. The experience in question was, I was watching a video a couple of weeks ago, or maybe a month or so ago, on I was, searching around, as I often do, about, various forms of American trad music, especially Appalachian influenced, old-timey, very specifically, not so much bluegrass or anything like that. We're talking, folk tunes, trad tunes with a traceable folkloric history, that kind of thing. And I was watching this one video in which a father and daughter were talking about how they managed to establish a community of musicians that comes to this cabin that they built periodically to actually come together and play music, and that the cabin's not lit, it has no electricity. They talked about how they built it and so on, that it was a group community project and all that kind of thing. It was really, really beautiful, very atmospheric, really, really lovely. But there was a point where the older man, the father, was talking to the cameraman. And as he spoke, he sort of stepped and turned in the house. And I suddenly, really unexpectedly, burst into tears, just completely inconsolable. And it took me a while to realize why. And I realized that I was responding to the fact that I no longer exist in those types of timber structures. In the part of the US that I come from, but also very distinctly in the part of the US that I would have played a lot of traditional music in. But again, like a lot of the sort of houses that my family would have occupied during my, childhood and in my teens and so on, are timber structures. They're timber frame houses. They are entirely made of wood. I suspect this is possibly a little bit more of an East Coast-esque thing. East Coast, maybe, again, at any town that has maybe a little bit more of a long-term history. So I would imagine maybe not so much the West might not have quite this tendency. The house I grew up in was an Edwardian sort of early days of toothpaste, squeezing houses out of a toothpaste thing, but still very much a timber structure. My grandparents' house was, I think, over 200 years old, something around that line. So that when you're in an old house, or indeed in an old cabin, and you move in it, it responds to you. A timber structure talks to you and it relates to you when you move in it. It's not just a creaking floorboard. You can kind of feel the whole house respond. You can feel the air quality in the house respond. And in this video clip, I could see that recognizable air quality. You could tell that the air in the room had a slight humidity to it, that it was a certain type of temperature, or like the types of temperature you get at a certain time of year. So, the quality of light seemed to me to either be a very sort of gently lit afternoon or possibly filmed in the morning without knowing the orientation of the house. It was a little hard to tell because that's not what they were talking about. But you could just see the way in which the light was filtered in through the window, and that as he stepped, the house didn't just creak. You could see that it, like the walls responded to him. You could see, it's very hard to describe to anyone who wouldn't have been raised in a timber structure, and only timber structures, exclusively timber structures, basically, from a certain age onwards in my case. And part of the reason that was difficult for me all of a sudden is that timber structures are not common here in Ireland. It's not really the main choice, or even it's just really not very common. To have a house that is partly timber is also not even common. The floors in most houses, unless you're on an upper level of a house, and even then it can be this, tend to be concrete or stone, flagstone kind of scenario. There aren't basements really in Irish houses. Basements aren't really a thing. Loads of the houses are not even brick. Like brick would be a bit more of an American construction method as well. They're kind of, I guess, traditionally you would have kind of a plaster type structure. I'm blanking on the exact methods at the moment, but whitewash with thatch roofing and that kind of thing, and a very sort of hard packed earthen floor. So again, you have variations. These days it tends to be, really industrially imposed concrete. And, it's not as simple as creaking floorboards beneath you. It's also like the subtleties of old wood, that breathes with the humidity, and then exhales when it gets drier, of a house that when you open your front door, the entire house kind of shifts to welcome you. That a house that sounds different in the morning than it does in the evening, a house that sounds at all. And I'm kind of, waxing poetic here and rambling on for ages, but this is kind of what I mean when I'm talking about like sensory detail. It's not just visuals, it's like all of the information incoming. And, you know, sometimes with the decor of this room, I do feel a little bit frustrated. And sometimes I'm looking around going, is it just because this is like an apartment that's way too expensive for what it is? Housing market crash, that kind of stuff? Is it just because, you know, I am kind of in a stage of life where I'm trying really, really hard to get to the next phase, as it were, and I'm very close? Is it just a personal sense of frustration that's totally normal? But sometimes I look around the room and I go, it's just, I'm not in a wooden house. I'm not in a wooden house. And my head, like, I need to be, I suppose if I'm going to continue to not be in a wooden house, then I need to be in a house that in other ways has a much more organic relationship with its surroundings. This building does not. This building is all sorts of chaos. It's not, you know, it's not solely occupied by us either. It's just really, not that, you know, again, it's hard to explain, but the manner in which this building is occupied and in use is frustrating. The way it's, even the way in which it's partitioned off, it's because the original building wasn't meant to be multiple different compartments, and it's been very cheaply done. So, you know, again, I'm not claiming that there's no answer to this. What I'm claiming is that I need to really dig into this sort of stuff so that I can see what are the component parts that need amalgamation. What is this alchemical process going to look like? What are the background baseline nutrients? What's the fire? What's the nourishment of the wheat and the grapes? What's my animist understanding of these things within the crucible that is myself? You know, I have to develop an understanding of those things if I am to bring them together, intermingle them, cross them in a way that then starts to unify into a whole, which I imagine will have really interesting implications for things like even just the Three of Wands. Let's see. Yeah, beginning of the development of the activity represented by the previous Arcanum. In this one, I have other things to say about this book because it's peculiarly specific at times, very literal at times. So it does say beginning of success in intellectual and commercial enterprises. And there's a reason, there's kind of charts of correspondences at the beginning that have a very specific way of relating meaning to the image and why the image is formulated the way it is and so on. And it also advocates for like being flexible about that. But, you know, if we have in this, there's the caduceus kind of behind, but we have also this huge tree depicted, which is a departure in some ways from the Three of Scepters in the book. Yeah, and again, I think in the book it's meant to be kind of a representation of hazel. And relating to Mercury, which is the explanation for the dog symbol. But again, if I come at this from like an Irish mythological structure, the dog symbol remains relevant. A sort of mystical, mercurial representation of a tree remains relevant. And also, if you look in the card, there's a hill in the background, which again feels very, very, very related to the landscape around me here in Ireland. I'm in Cork, it's very hilly anyway, but also hills obviously have a very mythological and sacred component to them. And what do I then do as I'm like amalgamating these? Like, I think it's just so interesting. It's basically like acknowledging that I've always done this on some level, that many people do this with their surroundings. And I do feel that to work with this deck nudges me in a better direction. Like it's an acknowledgement and then a moving on, because I don't have the opportunity or the option to move back or to go back. I don't wish to either. To be clear, I do not want to. But I also can't. Absolutely cannot. So there's this like almost relentless forward movement, but it's a forward movement, as in this case, in a very fiery sense, with like determination to do it in a way that is more holistic, I suppose. Anyway, I don't know if any of that made sense. Like I said, I don't normally ever speak to humans or look at humans or even want to think about humans this early in the morning. I like to have hours and hours to myself if I possibly can before I consider trying to, you know, seem more human in my presentation and composure. But anyway, that's what I had to say for now, and I wanted to document it. And it's going to be with a hodgepodge of my usual camera and now my tablet camera. So hopefully all of this will work. So more updates to come, I guess, as I keep working on this.
So that's all for now. I will check back in when I have more footage, but also more to say about this system. Hopefully I'll be like checking through like more resources on this, and anytime I come across something that I think I can find citations and resources about, I will always link them in the description, as is the case for like all of my videos. So yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. And hopefully you'll stay tuned for more on this. I hope everyone is doing well, taking care of themselves to the best of their ability, and being kind. And I'll see you all next time. Bye.